Welcome everyone to the first in the series of housing workshops from the UCSB Blum Center. It is my absolute delight to host this first workshop on the state of the housing crisis in California and the Central Coast specifically. 2 weeks from now, we'll be having a follow-up talk on the subject of the Isla Vista housing crisis specifically. We were going to be getting lovely opening remarks from our director, Alice O'Connor, to begin, but unfortunately, she's having technical difficulties joining the Zoom meeting, and hopefully we'll be hearing a little more from her later. But without further ado, I would like to introduce State Senator Monique Limón, who represents Ventura and Santa Barbara counties in the state Senate, and who knows a thing or two about the housing crisis. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Isaac, and thank you everyone for putting this together. I think that this is an important conversation, and certainly in my time in the legislature, this has been a very, very important topic, policy issue, and debate that we've had. I think that as I think about our conversations related to housing and the housing crisis, I certainly never lose sight that I represent Santa Barbara and Ventura counties, where what our practices and the best models will look like may be different than other parts of the state. However, our responsibility is equal to everybody in the state to try to figure out how we address some of the housing issues locally. I think as someone who was born and raised in the very district that I represent, it's certainly very personal to me because it means a lot when folks can live in the community that they grew up in and be able to come back. And I can't tell you how many people who work here, who live here, who are friends, who are family members, talk about the challenges of being able to live in the community that they grew up in. And so it's very personal to me from that lens. And I think that as you all think about the conversation, the panel you want to have, I just want to present to you, a perspective from the state, a perspective from your state legislator, which is one of the many lenses that's applied to how we have a conversation about the housing, the totality of the housing complications. It's certainly not the only one or the sole one, but for me, I think of the role of, how do we work with local governments and our localities and our partners? What's the role of stakeholders on all sides of this issue? And, lastly is where does the state come in and what kind of a framework or guardrails or guidelines does the state play? But those really are the big three kind of elements that I think about when I think of housing. And just for context, so people know, I'm now in the state Senate, but I used to be in the state assembly. And for the 4 years that I was in the state assembly, I served as a member of the housing committee. So I am one of the members that has had the chance to vote, to deliberate, to discuss, to analyze, to comment, to provide feedback on more housing bills compared to other members who have not served on the housing committee. So I come from it also from that lens, right, of having spent quite a bit of time thinking about different elements that impact our housing issues here in the state. I think that starting off when it thinks to our local partners, and I do want to call them partners, because the state alone cannot be successful in solving this problem just through state law. And I know that because we have several state laws that are in place, and without the partners at the local level, we really aren't successful. And so I think about the fact that we work with many of our city councils, with our board of supervisors, with water agencies, with school districts who all weigh into housing. And I think it's an important recognition because sometimes folks forget that, water, sanitary districts also weigh into housing because they will have to provide services, and so do school districts because it impacts either adding enrollment or declining enrollment in the area. And so these are all part of our stakeholder groups. And certainly I think that from my perspective, when I think of the local folks, I think of the fact that their job really is to help us facilitate our laws and implement our laws. And without their partnership, it can't happen. Now, I know that sometimes what tends to be really tough and where we find a divide between the state and local governments is when the state supersedes local governance, regulations or guidelines. That's happened on some occasion. I think you will be discussing a couple big bills that went through the legislature last year where that was part of the element. And so a lot of our communities locally feel like they're not able to implement the laws in the same ways. And so they would like to have more local control and say over how those are implemented. But I would say that that's probably one of the bigger debates between local governments and at the state level. Additionally, I think that, we look at the fact that so often people are trying to determine where and how did the problem get created about housing, that we don't have enough housing and that it's very expensive. And so we have looked quite a bit at zoning, at local zoning, and what that means to the production of housing and cost of housing. And so I think that that's one element where we try to work with local governments. But like I said, some of our challenges are when the state feels that they're in a position to supersede what local governments are doing around zoning. And I know, again, that you'll discuss some of those examples. I think locally we see, a variety of opinions related to housing, but so often a lot of nuances are put into two buckets. You're either pro-housing or housing concerned. And I think that, it's sometimes a little bit more complicated than putting folks in two buckets, but nonetheless, those are very much how folks are perceived. Do you want to be all in for housing, or do you, want no housing? And so we have the YIMBY NIMBY kind of perspective that kind of plays out. However, I'm not sure that that's always super reflective of a lot of the, issues that come up with when it comes to housing. And locally, we also see that even though the state may be moving issues forward, there are challenges to some of the things that the state have done, challenges that end up in court, and challenges by our local governments to see, where that happens. And so even with the state's attempt to, facilitate, fast forward, or streamline, it doesn't negate that there is a local role. And I think that that's really important. And so I do see our local governments as partners in trying to facilitate the housing production and trying to understand how we bring down the cost of housing. Now, that's, from a local government perspective. I think from a stakeholder perspective, there's really a lot of other conversations that we're having in terms of, what do we use? Do we use the carrot or the stick? What are the the incentives for folks to want to build? Especially when you think about the different types of housing. We know that we're in a shortage of all housing, right? Market-based, workforce, and affordable. But what kind of incentives do we use, either locally or at the state level, to try to get to a place where we are able to build the housing that we need? And so certainly there is a lot of debate around that. Additionally, I think that the state has tried to facilitate funding to be part of that incentivized opportunity when it comes to some projects. And I think that that's something that you'll continue to see, but not to the extent that we're able to. We don't have a dedicated funding source that is stable and sustainable on a year-to-year basis. But certainly it is one approach of the state. I want to just give a shout out to the Santa Barbara Housing Authority, because I think that's a really great example, and not the only one, but a great example of a local agency really committed to trying to figure out how to leverage resources to bring more so that we can do more affordable housing in our area. And so those are some of the best practices and models that we look at in terms of finding partners that can help us leverage to do more. I think that, additionally, here in Santa Barbara and Ventura, you're going to get into a conversation about natural resources. We've been in the drought for several years. The drought is, at a really bad place now. And so people talk about, what does this mean, in relation to building more housing and making more connections, and the cost of those connections. Now, I think, again, I would urge us not to rush to paint any particular nuance or opinion or side into a pro or anti, because I think that these are really issues we have to grapple with, right? And so often I hear folks say, well, if they brought this issue up, they're likely pro or they're likely anti. And I think that it's much more complicated. I have had the chance to vote on hundreds of housing bills. And in the 5 years that, I've been in the legislature 6 years, and in the last 5 years, we've had 189 bills signed by the governor related to housing. I urge us, in addition to also know that we may talk about 2 or 3, but when the state's approach is to look at 189, I mean, just last year alone, the Senate Housing Committee reviewed 102 proposals. Obviously, those don't all make it to the finish line, but I think it's important to people to understand that we're looking at different types of housing, different types of zoning, different types of incentives, and certainly looking at ways not just to streamline housing, but also work with local governments on different types. I mean, I think that the ADU bills that we've done in the state have been an example of like, look, we're trying to understand how we solve this problem through multiple lenses in the state legislature. And so as you all have this conversation, please know that the state, in 2017, for example, passed a 15 bill package that was very much dedicated to address some of this. And if there was one law that could be passed that would solve it, we would have already done that. You are seeing so many laws because we have 58 different counties in the state who are really different in so many ways in terms of the population, the resources available to them, and of course, the local governments. I think that we are going to be seeing more from the state level when it comes to enforcing our housing elements. You'll hear probably more from the state. The state really wants our local communities to be able to meet their responsibility in terms of the housing. And certainly, while you may talk about bills that were passed last year, I'm not sure that we actually know the impact immediately. It will take a little bit of time to understand what that impact is to our local communities. So I know this is going to be a wonderful, fruitful discussion. I wanted just to share a little bit as you start this conversation so that you understand from the state's perspective, what are some of the concerns, that we have, but also what are some of the opportunities and who's a part of this conversation. You are all part of this conversation. Every single one of you gets to weigh into this conversation in different ways. And as your state representative, I will also say that if I had all the answers to this, I certainly would have laid them on the table. And I spent a lot of time having this discussion, but absolutely believe that our locals, our researchers, our academics, our professionals, those folks that are in the world of creating, building, and, funding housing opportunities all get to weigh in to help us understand how we move this forward. I am very committed to this ongoing conversation and working with local governments as partners to figure out how we get this done. So thank you all for your time and thank you all for participating. I know this is going to be a wonderful panel discussion that we will all learn from. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Limón. And now I would like to invite the director of the Blum Center, Dr. Alice O'Connor, to provide some opening remarks. And thank you all for your patience as we've sorted out the technical issues with this as well.
Isaac?
Yes. Hello, you're on.
Okay, I need to know, I have no idea whether I'm even visible because our technical difficulties. Just so that you all know, this is the first time I've ever been officially, quote unquote, removed from a Zoom meeting. I think that's some special status. In any case, I'm talking to you from my phone, so excuse the backgrounds and technical glitches. I will be very brief. I was hoping to greet everybody before Senator Limón made her remarks, but I want to thank you so much, Senator Limón, for starting us off. And I also want to note that we very much appreciate the senator opening up for us because she's really exercised so much leadership in the area of housing, but so much else having to do with the quality of life on the Central Coast. My name is Alice O'Connor. As Isaac said, I'm a professor of history at UCSB, and I direct the Blum Center on Poverty, Inequality, and Democracy, which is hosting tonight's workshop. As I think Isaac already mentioned, this is the first in a series that will be focusing on critical issues of affordable housing in the region. And I want to note that we have a second one coming up on April 28th. So please keep your eye out for that because the focus of that is going to be the roots, implications, and possible solutions to the massive housing crunch that UCSB is facing right now. I also want to mention that this is part of a broader initiative that we have launched with the Fund for Santa Barbara, which is called the Regional Equity Initiative. This is a project of community engaged research, public discussion, and collective action, most importantly, collective action to address structurally rooted inequities, including housing inequities in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties. I get now to backhandedly introduce Isaac Hale, who, as you know, is the facilitator of tonight's discussion. Isaac is currently the Blum Center's Equity Research Postdoctoral Scholar. Before taking on that position, he received his PhD in political science from UC Davis. And I'm very excited to say that he is about to join the faculty at Occidental College as an assistant professor in the Department of Politics. Now, Isaacs will tell you some more about the logistics of how the meeting will go and how you can participate and ask your questions. But before that, I do want to give a shout out to the other people who've made this whole panel possible, including Brian Zuniga, who is an immensely talented Blum Center undergraduate assistant and communication major at UCSB, and Keisha Arnold, who is the Blum Center academic coordinator. So with that rather abbreviated set of remarks, I want to thank you all for coming and turn it over to Isaac to get the panel discussion going.
Wonderful. Thank you for those remarks, Dr. O'Connor. And again, my apologies for the technical difficulties with this portion of the workshop. Before we get into our panel discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to, I'm going to be giving a brief presentation on state and regional trends in housing, and then we'll move on from there to a moderated discussion between me and the panelists, followed by an audience Q&A. So please, if you could hold your questions until the end, you are of course welcome to put them in the chat, but we will provide opportunity at the end for folks to raise their hands and come on mic, come on video as well. Without further ado, let me break out the slideshow. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to be discussing state and regional trends in the housing crisis. I would like to echo Alice's remarks, thanking our guest panelists, thanking the Blum Center folks who made today's workshop possible, and thanking Senator Limón for her opening remarks. So let's look at some statewide housing data. So rents and home prices have skyrocketed in the last decade. The median home price in California is now $834,000, right? Extremely high. And that skyrocketing is happening not only over the last decade, but particularly sharply since the start of the pandemic. While the median home price is now $834,000, it was only $659,000 in 2020. We know the supply chain issues and construction costs are one factor that are driving these increasing costs, but we also know, as the senator alluded to, that there are substantial political disagreements as well about housing policy in the state and locally. So here we can see in data from the Legislative Analyst's Office, the rise in California housing prices from 1940 through 2015. And as you can see, the rise in housing prices in California substantially outstrips the rise in housing prices throughout the country. But I should note that stopping in 2015, as this chart from the LAO office does, omits some of the story. When you look here at this graph using data from the California Association of Realtors, this is a graph from the Orange County Register. This is data from 1990 through 2021, with the y-axis here being the median home price. You can see that there is a huge spike that occurs beginning in 2020 and bringing us to where we are today. As an interesting bit of trivia, guess which county had the biggest jump in home prices from 2020 to 2021? It is in fact Santa Barbara County, where the median home price hit $1.1 million in April 2021. Of course, it's not just the story of home prices. Rents have increased rapidly as well. Most metropolitan areas in California have substantially higher rents than the country as a whole, and Ventura and Santa Barbara County are some of the most egregious in this regard. And indeed, between January 2020 and August 2021, rents rose 14% in the Ventura metropolitan area. We also see that there's inequality in rent by race. Non-white Californians are substantially more likely to be renters. And we see that low-income households are much more likely to be affected by high rents. So here we can see income brackets broken out by what's called AMI, or area median income. And we can see that for those who are extremely low income or very low income, a very large percentage are either cost burdened, meaning they spend 30% of income on rent, or severely cost burdened, meaning they're spending over 50% of their income on rent. And this is true, for extremely low income, very low income individuals, even middle income families, over a third are cost burdened when it comes to rent. And of course, this brings a question of how do we get here, right? What's the policy side of this equation? Well, despite soaring costs and population, construction has slowed. And this isn't just a pandemic story. When you look at data since 1990, construction has almost always been well below the California average construction. And this has been exacerbated since the 2008 financial crisis, as you can see in this graph. And housing policy battles have been heating up in local and state government as well. It's a contentious issue. There are stark disagreements about housing policy at both the state and the local level. And the Democratic Party is divided, right? These disagreements divide the Democratic Party, which controls the state legislature and the most populous municipal governments. The California Environmental Quality Act has been in the news a lot lately because it's a particular flashpoint in these housing battles, right? It requires impact reports before new development. It's designed to protect the environment, but has also been frequently a tool in these fights over new housing developments as homeowners bring lawsuits opposing new housing and growth on the grounds of environmental protection. We saw this very notably in the news recently when homeowners in Berkeley successfully sued to limit enrollment at UC Berkeley, claiming growth would overburden scarce local housing and local resources. This was also in the news very recently as a new bill passed the state legislature and was signed by the governor, allowing the UCs to nevertheless increase enrollment despite that ruling. So many fights around new housing in general are around this idea of zoning, so legal housing restrictions. And interjecting themselves into this fight in 2021, the legislature passed Sb9 and Sb10. Sb9 allows duplexes in all single family lots, regardless of zoning, and Sb10 allows for upzoning near transit hubs without CEQA review. And interestingly, cities are already passing laws to limit Sb9. This is a contentious battle. So we've seen this particularly in cities with high concentrations of wealthy homeowners, places like Cupertino, Palo Alto, Pasadena, Woodside, Los Altos Hills, and as you might guess, Santa Barbara and Goleta as well. This was one of my favorite stories related to Sb9, which is from a story from the town of Woodside, California. And it's a small town near Palo Alto that's home to tech billionaires and investment managers. The average home price is over $5 million. And in order to avoid the mandates of Sb9, the California town attempted to declare itself a mountain lion sanctuary, which did not ultimately succeed, but created some good headlines. We similarly saw the city of Palo Alto moving to expand its historic registry, so adding a bunch of homes to the list of historic places in order to exempt them from Sb9. And similarly, we saw a fight happening with the city of Pasadena over similar attempted historic landmark designations. And I think this brings us to the ultimate question of what might housing justice look like in the state of California? Some have proposed massive construction. Some have advocated, particularly on the grounds of building more affordable housing. And many have called for strong commitments from state and local governments to use existing resources to combat the housing and homelessness crisis. Activists have also called for tenant protection from eviction and arbitrary rent hikes. And before I go to our panelists, I want to briefly talk about some of the data we have that specifically speaks to the crisis in the Central Coast. So at the end of 2021, the UCSB Blum Center, in collaboration with the Equity Research Institute at USC and the Fund for Santa Barbara, released a report entitled Towards a Just and Equitable Central Coast, that's a regional equity study on the crisis of inequality in the Central Coast region of California. And here we focus predominantly on Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. And the data in the coming slides are from 2013 through 2018. So here we can see the crisis of economic inequality in the Central Coast. We can see that economic inequality in the Central Coast outstrips the country, with the lower percentiles and the higher percentiles both exceeding the national averages. We can also see that the region is rapidly racially diversifying, right? This is an important context for the economic inequality we saw in the previous slide. So by the time it's 2050, the white population of the two-county region will be less than 30%, right? So the region is rapidly diversifying at the same time as it's grappling with high levels of inequality. In addition, at the same time that this diversification is occurring, non-white and immigrant residents are far more likely to live in overcrowded housing, here defined as having more than one person per room. And Ventura County and Santa Barbara County are two of the most rent burden counties in the entire country. Ventura County coming in at number 5 with 58% of its residents rent burden, and Santa Barbara County coming in at number 11 with 56% of its residents rent burdened. Again, this is defined as over 30% of gross income being spent on rent. We can also see that home ownership is stratified by race. This is data from Santa Barbara County, although the figures look very similar for Ventura, with white residents far more likely to be homeowners than non-white residents. And housing is a top issue in public opinion surveys. It comes up again and again, housing and homelessness. And existing home ownership, as we saw in the last slide, is stratified by race. And we've seen that as costs have increased, Latino families have been increasingly moving away from the extremely expensive places in the two-county region, like Santa Barbara, to more affordable locations, such as Oxnard, Lompoc, and Santa Maria. So we know that rapidly rising housing prices are part of the story, but rent burden is also extreme in the region. And as was mentioned earlier, workshop number 2, that will be taking place on April 28th, will focus on the housing crisis in Isla Vista in particular, including the shortage in housing for college students in the region. Right. And so the Central Coast has been really grappling with this crisis of affordability. The median home price as of 2021 in Ventura County was $685,000, and in the city of Santa Barbara, $1.5 million. And average rents in the city of Santa Barbara and Oxnard were around $2,300 as well in August 2021, with rent burden disproportionately hitting historically disenfranchised groups. And according to one estimate, the Latino population in the city of Santa Barbara shrunk by 24% between 2011 and 2018 due to skyrocketing rents. Right. And so increasing unhoused population and heightened economic and racial inequality are real consequences of this crisis of housing in the two-county region. And the Central Coast needs to do more on affordable housing. The counties and cities are obligated by law, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHANA, to plan for affordable housing. And between 2015 and 2023, the city of Santa Barbara is obliged to construct 4,100 units, but as of 2020, fewer than half were constructed and few were affordable. And as of 2020, no city in Ventura County had completed even half its legally required construction. Okay. And if you are curious to learn more about the research we've done on housing inequality in the region and some of the some more context for those figures you just saw, we encourage you to read the study at www.centralcoastequity.org. You can read it there. There's also a condensed executive summary where you can find out all sorts of information about the crisis of inequality in the Central Coast region. All right, and with that, I would like to bring on our 2 panelists for today. So if Sarah and Stan, if you could go ahead and come on video and come on for us here. Excellent, wonderful. Okay, I'd like to introduce our 2 wonderful panelists here. We have Dr. Stan Oklobdzija, who is a visiting assistant professor at the UC Riverside School of Public Policy and has written extensively on the California housing crisis. And we're also very lucky to have with us today Sarah Treuhaft, who is the Vice President of Research at PolicyLink, and she also works on the National Equity Atlas in partnership with the USC Equity Research Institute, who are a partner with us on the regional equity study. So it is our absolute joy and delight to have both of these experts here with us today to share their insights. And so we're going to have a little bit of a conversation here. I'm going to ask them some questions, get their responses, and then we'll move on to a Q&A with the audience. So please save your questions, and I promise we will have plenty of time to get to them. Okay, excellent. So I would just like to start by asking our panelists, what does housing justice look like? Is there a good benchmark? What's a good way of thinking about housing justice?
Yeah, I can start. And we have reports on this that you can peruse. And we have a new way of thinking about it, or we are evolving our way of thinking about this in terms of housing futures. And I'll try to share a link about that because that's an exciting new way of thinking about it. But I think at the heart of it, housing justice is really a basic concept of like everyone, regardless of their race, gender, nativity, documentation status, right? Criminal records, history of criminal records, like everyone should have access to a safe, quality, affordable home in an opportunity-rich neighborhood, like a neighborhood that provides the things that everybody needs to be able to thrive, right? So I think that that's like, those are the outcomes that we want for all Californians. And we know that well, you were just showing data showing that that is not the current state of things. So I think it's like, how do you enable that vision? Bringing in this lens around futures, like I think that there is something around how do you have housing that allows people the stability to plan for their future, right? Because when you don't have housing security, your life is chaotic. If you don't know if your landlord is giving you a pay or quit notice and there's no housing, like it's really impossible to plan for the future. And we want to be able to have housing that allows people to plan for the future. So I'll stop there. There's several other definitions I could share, but it's a starting point.
Would you like to chime in, Stan?
No, I think Sarah gave a perfect answer there. I'd just say that housing justice really can be measured with housing affordability and proximity to work and proximity to opportunity-rich areas. Everyone in California should be able to live relatively close to where they work and be able to get to and from work without the use of a private automobile. And people really shouldn't be spending more than 25% of their take-home pay to live in any place that meets these conditions. So there needs to be housing types for everyone all over California, from studio apartments to housing units large enough to accommodate a family, right? Cities around the world have solved this problem with gentle density. You can see cities like Barcelona and Paris that have built to meet this demand, but cities in California, unfortunately, have been quite lacking.
Excellent, and that brings me to a follow-up question that maybe you can speak to, Stan. On a really basic level, how did we get here? What's the story of how California and the Central Coast ended up in a housing crisis?
Right, so I mean, there's a lot of like competing explanations of like, how did this get here? And like, who's the big villain to blame? And honestly, when you think about anything sort of complex in American policy, you really have to go back to the roots of the issue and see when land use policy was invented and to what sort of ends did it serve. And, maybe unsurprisingly for folks that are, economists or US history aficionados, housing starts, or sort of housing and land use policy start as a de facto means to enforce segregation, right? So we like to think of ourselves as very progressive here in California, but we forget that Berkeley, California, my very progressive hometown, invented single family zoning in the 1920s as a way to segregate undeveloped parts of the city following a Supreme Court decision in 1917 in Buchanan v. Worley, which prohibited racially exclusive zoning. So Berkeley goes and invents a backdoor to segregation to make a neighborhood prohibited for African Americans and Asian Americans, right, without having to say so in its city charter and run afoul of the law, right? So exclusionary zoning has this really long history in California where it uses the mechanism of supply and demand to constrain supply in order to raise prices. If you keep housing expensive, you keep housing exclusive. And when it's exclusive, it tends to be whiter, right? New immigrants, people of color, African Americans coming from the South can't afford these new exclusive larger homes. And thus you get to have your cake and not run afoul of the Supreme Court, right? So California's been playing whack-a-mole with this sort of mechanism ever since the Rumford Act of 1964, which attacked racially restricted covenants, unfortunately was overturned a couple years later with Proposition 7, I believe it was, and then later reinstated by the US Supreme Court, right? So following the California Fair Housing Act and the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968, many cities underwent these dramatic dezonings and downzonings, I should say, in the 1970s. So San Francisco around this period downzones the Haight neighborhood to prevent rapacious developers from tearing down these dilapidated Victorians and turning them into apartments. Now, it's probably just a coincidence that at this point in the 1970s, you see an influx of African-American families leaving the Western Addition, which was demolished for a variety of urban renewal projects, right? Likewise, around that time, Los Angeles drops its zone capacity from 10 million people to just a mere 4 million people, coincidentally what the population of Los Angeles is right now. So, I mean, if we think this is ancient history, but Proposition U was passed by a wide majority of Los Angeles voters in 1986. Its main proponent was a guy named Zev Yaroslavsky, who you all may have heard of. He was also one of the big impediments to extending subway service under Wilshire Boulevard to connect downtown Los Angeles and the richer, whiter neighborhoods of the LA's West Side. And Zev Yaroslavsky continues to be a major force in anti-housing movements today. So our housing crisis is entirely man-made. There's not some exogenous factor that fell from the sky. There's not some greedy developer of cabal of villains behind it, but rather it's the policies we enacted to constrain the supply of housing to keep our neighborhoods exclusive, right? So the real sort of drivers behind the housing crisis are the good citizens of various California cities who crowd into local government meetings and say, this new apartment will ruin my neighborhood character, or this development is going to take away my parking. They're the kind of people that Kathleen Einstein, a professor at Boston University and co-authors, called neighborhood defenders, right? These people that are more likely to be white, wealthy homeowners. And unfortunately, California law to this day provides these neighborhood defenders a panoply of options to block new housing, which they judiciously use, right? You mentioned CEQA in your opening remarks, but there's also onerous zoning rules, setback requirements, density limits, height limits, et cetera. There's the entire discretionary approval process, which adds a lot of uncertainty and a lot of complexity, which increases the price of units, which developers then pass on to consumers. And so around the mid-1990s, we hit the limits of California's built capacity, and thus prices started to increase.
Wow, thank you for that exhaustive history lesson, Stan. I appreciate it. And so I think we can all agree that addressing the housing crisis is an intrinsic good, right? As folks were saying, right, being able to live near your place of work, right, being able to be housed, that's an intrinsic good. But I think we can also agree that combating the housing crisis would help address inequality in some other domains as well, be they the wealth gap, be that racial inequality, be that immigration inequality in terms of immigration status. And Sarah, I'm wondering if you can maybe speak to how addressing the housing crisis would help address inequality in other areas as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the National Equity Atlas, which you referenced, it's our partnership with Equity Research Institute. We look at indicators of housing by race and ancestry. And, so we know from the data, home ownership, right? Because of structural and systemic racism that has locked Black Americans and other people of color out of home ownership, right? And home ownership is housing security, and it has been it can be a pathway to build wealth, right? So it's not the only thing that drives or contributes to wealth, but it can be. And we know there are huge racial disparities in home ownership. So people of color are disproportionately renting. Renting means you are more housing insecure. You're relying on your landlord. There's a power dynamic with your landlord. There are we do have more tenant protections in California than elsewhere in the country, but we don't have a lot of tenant protections. Even in the Bay Area, where it's a region that has more tenant protections, most tenants are unprotected. So renters don't have many protections. So I think that it is a huge racial equity issue, and, tenant protections, anything you do to solve the rental affordability crisis is going to improve our racial inequities. Also, we have a unique analysis I just wanted to share around. So if you didn't have housing on a rental burden, right? You referenced how rent burden, this traditional threshold. I like the 25% that you mentioned, but the standard threshold is 30% of your income on rent. So what we did with the Right to the City Alliance is we looked at, okay, if people weren't paying more than that, how much would they have more to spend on their household needs? And in California, that number is $8,300 something more per year that they would have to spend on transportation, childcare, education, right? So the overpayment for rent is really, cutting people off from opportunity. And that's contributing to these racial inequities. So I think that's gives a picture of this cycle. Also, you would have more resources to spend in your local community. So communities would do better too if people weren't paying so much for rent.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's a fantastic perspective. One of the questions I wanted to get at here is, Stan, you talked a little bit about the political side of this in your discussion of the history here. And I think something that we see in policy battles around housing time and time again is that the people who are most affected by the housing crisis, so be that renters, be that immigrants, be that people from, who are low income, they have decreased visibility, decreased voice in these policy debates. The people who often are heard the loudest are people who have already made it in terms of housing, right? And people who are, corporations or wealthy homeowners, right? What would it mean to give, for these people who are most affected by the housing crisis to have more of a voice? And how do you think there can be, an additional? How can we get to a place where there's, more political attention paid to those people with those needs?
Well, yeah, I think it's less of a mobilization question than a political institutions question, right? So the very structure of our local governments and how housing policy is decided, right? We have this hyper local system in American federalism, right? And so within California, you have 500 and some odd different policies, right? Like cities, counties, that sort of thing, right? And each of them has their own separate land use regime, right? But we know that housing is a regional demand, right? Demand for housing is for a certain area. So it doesn't really make much sense to have this sort of piecemeal approach to it, right? If we think about something like air pollution, would we want 500 plus different standards for vehicle emissions or for like whether you can burn tires in your backyard or something like that? No, it doesn't make any sense because we perceive these externalities, right? But for housing policy, we kind of do the monkeys with, covering their eyes and ears and pretend that it doesn't happen, right? So for me, it's this big political institutions question. And like everything in the United States, local government has this really huge incumbency bias, right? So the people that have remained there the longest get sort of a higher weighted vote. When you think about, for example, what becomes a city and what is just a neighborhood in a larger city or a swath of an unincorporated county, it's not like some state of nature, right? Municipal fragmentation, right? What became an incorporated city, especially after 1964 and the development of the Lakewood Plan, right, which let cities incorporate at a much lower cost by contracting for county services. I believe I'm a former Santa Barbara County resident, and I think Goleta still doesn't run its own PD, or at least didn't when I was there in 2006, right? So by contracting with county services, cities are able to incorporate at a much lower cost than they would have before. So now cities get land use authority, right? So this sort of kind of fragmentation, right? This sort of fractalization of California and sort of the propensity for whiter, wealthier areas to become their own cities and gain their own land use authority allows homeowners to use local government as a cartel enforcer, right? And then given Proposition 13, which limits the amount of revenue that can come from property taxes, right? It makes more sense for a city to position itself as anti-growth, right? Because new people just increase the tax burden and sort of gear themselves towards maintaining stasis and collecting money either from commercial or sales tax revenue. So I think it's really less a sense of getting people involved and getting people excited than really just sort of re-examining the kind of broken nature of how we decide on land use and housing, given its importance and given the just profound detrimental consequences that our housing crisis has. I mean, just look anywhere in this state and you'll see it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if there's time to add on to that.
Please.
I mean, I think of it, I think I was thinking a similar thing, but maybe from a different angle, and that we think about how are we embedding equity in all of our policy making, right? So that's another path to structural equity. So thinking about an equity lens in our policy and decision making. Like just today, actually, the White House convened it's been a year since their executive order on racial equity that said, we're going to do this at the federal level. We're going to embed racial equity into all of our policymaking efforts. And the agencies just released their racial equity action plans, right? In California, we have a very vibrant local government effort around embedding equity into all efforts. And so I think it does kind of start there to then think about who is making the decisions and are the policies equitable? Do they have is there distributional equity in the impacts of policies, and analyzing in that way who decides, as you mentioned, Isaac. So I think that's a big piece of it. And then I just also mentioned in terms of like structural equity, it's like, are renters, are any of our legislators renters? Some, but it's not many, so like, is there representation of renters in our, elected offices and in government too, to bring in that experience and then develop policies based on that experience.
Yeah, and while we're on that subject of representation, Stan, you recently wrote a really great piece that I loved called "America's Cities Need Multi-Party Democracy," which argues for electoral reform as a key component of improving housing policy. What is it about the way we run our elections, especially at the local level, that's not conducive to productive housing policy in your view?
Oh, appreciate that. Thank you. So I think it actually just goes a lot beyond housing policy, though I do believe multi-party democracy in our cities and our local institutions would help with that as well. And, it goes to this problem today that we're just really not recruiting people into elected office, like Sarah said, that have the experiences and the will to deal with these big problems. I mean, I think it's 2 members of our state legislature are renters, but I mean, in my city in Los Angeles, 0 of the 15 city council members are renters, even though I think 50-something% of Angelenos rent. In San Francisco, there's a higher number of renters, and I believe just Matt Haney, the supervisor, is a renter, right? So a similar sort of imbalance, And so, I mean, like, I guess in smaller cities, you can think of like, well, it's kind of a thankless job to be an elected official, right? You don't get paid anything and you have to sit there every 2 weeks and have everyone yell at you for no money at night, and no one wants that. But in larger cities where it's an actual professional job, right? And you make a salary and you have a staff and you can do a lot, you have these officials that are essentially running uncontested and extremely low turnout races. I mean, until extremely recently in California, until state law preempted local law and forced cities to change their election dates, you had a lot of cities running elections on off-cycle years, right? So like not during a midterm or not during a presidential election, often weird months like March or something like that. And no one's really thinking about politics. No one's really clued in. So it sort of biases the electorate towards a more engaged section of the town's population, right? That would be higher income people, that would be white people, that would be homeowners, right? Who have a real stake in the game. So, you know, you have that sort of problem as well. But on a larger level, right? On a larger level, the reason we have, you know, such really lackluster city elections is I think there's a lack of partisanship in California, right? Everyone's a Democrat and most city elections are officially nonpartisan. So no one knows anything about a candidate besides their name and whatever their occupation gets put down as. I know there was a person who changed his name legally to judge who was running for judge just so he could get that on the ballot, right? So, you know, barring you wanting to change your name, right, to something, I don't know. So like this is a very big problem because voters in local elections don't really have much information to go on, right? And they don't really have a way to check incumbents, right? So our democracy works because voters have a set of preferences, right? They sort of look at a candidate, a set of candidates, they sort of understand their preferences, they calibrate those preferences towards their own, and then they cast a ballot, right? So any break in that change and your democracy just isn't working, right? That causal pathway just isn't happening, right? So we don't have any way to remove incumbents that aren't doing a good job. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of a sudden Republicans step in to fill the void, right? I think that would be sort of an anathema in most of our communities, like my own included. But rather, I think we should look to the example of other countries that have had municipal level parties come in and fill the void. So for example, imagine you took a look at your city ballot and you had people from, I don't know, the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, or you had a transit riders union or a renters union or a YIMBY group or something like that, right? That sort of partisan information on the ballot would give voters a better chance or a better ability to calibrate their own preferences towards that of the elected official. And the way we do that is by getting rid of our single member district model, right? And adopting what a lot of other advanced democracies around the world do. And instead of having just one person represent a district, have 3 or 4 or whatever, right? It allows for more diverse representation where everyone in a given geographic organization can sort of, or geographic unit can get their kind of champion on the council. And it also breaks this one party stranglehold over city politics, right? I think like they would sort of represent a big step forward in California democracy.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to turn our discussion towards policy a little bit here before we move on to the Q&A. Sarah, you recently published this new report, State of Waiting, California's Rental Assistance Program on the eve of expiration, which talks about California's Emergency Rental Assistance Program, ERAP, which ended at the end of March. Can you talk about why you and your co-authors think this program was so important and why you've called for its extension and how it could be improved going forward if it is extended?
Yeah, you know, we've been tracking rent debt, this issue, since the beginning of the pandemic and responding to communities' need for some research to try to extend eviction moratoria that they had put in place, right? So this paper really comes out of an analysis and dashboard actually that you can go get data for your community. And so I'll plunk that in once I'm done talking, but so it really emerged out of this, like our focus on rent debt crisis and emergency rental assistance, right? We didn't set it up until so far into the pandemic. It was like 9 months into the pandemic. And granted, there was individual assistance, there was cash assistance, which helped, but you need dedicated housing solutions. So huge rent debt crisis, people who have lost work and income because of the pandemic disrupting their work and their life. right? And it's disproportionately low-income renters, disproportionately renters of color who have this debt. So then we get rental assistance, and it's like, it's wonderful, right? We say we're gonna help you. We recognize it is not your fault. We're gonna make you whole. We're gonna clear this debt. Landlords, we recognize you also need, to pay mortgages, and we're gonna pay it, right? So it's this great thing. We've been tracking it, but it's been really a mess in terms of people getting through the pipeline. So we were hearing so many stories of tenants getting evicted as they were waiting for decisions from the state. And so there's like, when we first started looking at this, most people hadn't had their applications reviewed. A third of people who applied to the program, when they applied, they were facing an eviction. They had an actual threat from their landlord, or a notice, or a filing. So, it's like people are on the precipice here, and then they're waiting months to get decisions. So, so it's been very challenging to set up this program. They're finally processing the applications more quickly, partially because we're all focusing on it, but then they close the program. And the pandemic is not over for all workers, and there is still a lot of rent debt. And a lot of people, from the research that's been done from surveys, have not yet applied or been able to apply because the application being challenging, language access issues, et cetera. So it's we see it as very premature to close the program, because there's clear demand based on how many applications kept coming into the program and other data showing lingering rent debt. So, it really stopped itself short when it was just starting to work. And then another key issue is that the eviction protections that are afforded to tenants who have applied to the program, they did finally extend them until the end of June, but based on our calculations, it will be way beyond that it will take them to get through all the applications. So really important program, but stopped too short. There's been a lot of problems, and people are getting evicted as they've, while they're waiting. So it's really about how do we protect those people and make good on the promise of this program, that we will not let this debt that you accrued prohibit you from recovering, and being a part of the upturn that we want to create.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists. I'm going to ask you to stick around for a few more minutes as we do the Q&A portion now. For those of you in the audience, feel free to turn your video on. I'm going to ask you to use the hand raise feature if you would like to go on mic and ask your question that way. I will call on you. We'll pretend it's a classroom. But yes, use the hand raise feature if you would like to go on mic and ask your question verbally. If you ask your question in the chat, I will read it aloud to the panelists and ask them to respond. And you can get to that hand raise feature with the reactions button at the bottom. And that'll give you a hand raise. Okay, I'm going to take the first question from Dick Flax. Dick, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. This has been enlightening because of the richness of the diagnoses, the data, and so forth. And I appreciate the emphasis that we heard on the problems of resistance to housing in the part of settled and more affluent communities. That's certainly a factor, but I'm very disturbed, in fact, that the diagnosis we're hearing over and over again about the problems of housing is rooted in people who are just trying to protect the communities that they're in, defend their neighborhoods, no matter what their class and race. Are they the problem? We are unique, I believe, in the advanced industrial societies with the absence of a meaningful national social housing program that can guarantee the kind of housing as a right that you started with, or at least provide the resources, the direction, the policy that can lead that way. We don't have that policy. And in the state, the emphasis on zoning and density as if that were going to create 3 million housing units. It's to me absurd. Maybe I'm off base there, but at least that's the point I would make. So can we have both the folks on the panel talk a little bit about social housing, about what other than the private market is going to be the foundation for housing as a right rather than a commodity?
I'm happy to respond. We're working on this, so I fully agree with you. And PolicyLink is working on this now in partnership with other organizations to figure out how can we have a social housing solution in California, recognizing, the market is not, has not been delivering products for, like housing for low-income people for a long time, right? You need to have subsidies to produce low-income housing. And so we have to focus on how do we produce housing that is affordable and how are we going to do that and how are we going to ensure that we preserve it, right? So I did want to reference, there's a new study out that is underscoring your exact point from one of my mentors, Karen Chappell at UC, actually now she's at University of Toronto, but it's through the UC Berkeley Urban Displacement Project with the Federal Reserve and some other researchers really looking at this question and finding like, it's not renter protections. Like renter protections are good, they help. Market rate production helps, but neither of those things are going to deliver the amount of affordable housing we need to solve the crisis. We need social housing and we need massive protection and preservation of existing affordable housing. So I just agree.
I just say I also agree with the social housing approach. California has been basically diddling and doing nothing on housing for 40 years. And the problem has metastasized to such a point that dramatic intervention is needed, right? I mean, like this is basically like a hurricane evacuation. You can't just rely on Uber and like private bus companies or something like that. Like you need something with the force of a state to step in, right? I will say though that until we have a system of robust market rate construction, this problem is not going to go away. This problem will keep getting worse and worse and worse. This is like if you have a cancer diagnosis, you have to quit smoking. It's not going to replace chemotherapy, but unless you attack this root cause, just building social housing isn't going to make this problem go away. And I will say one more thing about social housing. So I'm a big supporter of social housing. I'm going to shout out AB 2053, which is a bill going through the legislature right now. To start a social housing program in California. It's assembled by the most extreme coalition of people, a Democratic socialist from San Jose, a labor activist from East Los Angeles, and like the king of the YIMBY legislators, Scott Wiener from San Francisco. So if all three of them can get on board, hopefully the legislature can get on board as well. So that's important, but I will say the problems that come from local opposition to market rate housing will also affect social housing as well. So here in Los Angeles, we had this problem or this program where every member of the city council pledged to build 222 homeless supportive housing units in their district, right? 222, it's an extremely tiny number, nowhere near the need to even make a dent in LA's unhoused population, right? But of the 15 council members who all took this pledge, 4 years later, 6 of them hadn't done it. In fact, they hadn't even started, right? There was a plan to build a homeless shelter on a municipal parking lot in Venice Beach, right? If you've been to Venice Beach, you understand the severity of the homelessness crisis in Venice Beach. Yet people came out of the woodwork to oppose a homeless shelter on a literal parking lot and even went as far to put a fake bomb on the scene to halt construction. So until we get rid of those mechanisms where people can say not in my backyard, we're just going to be playing the same game, chasing our tails again, even with the addition of social housing.
All right, thank you. Lenny, go ahead.
Thank you. Hey, I wanted to take a different tangent, and that is more of an economic tangent. And it seems to me that tax policy has a really great influence on housing and development in general. It really isn't the land use policies, it's the tax policies. And as long as it doesn't pay government agencies to approve housing, they've got all the expense and no income sources for that housing, there just isn't going to be any housing built. It's just going to be more tail chasing. We'll be back here 10 years from now and it won't have happened. Yeah, a little bit, but not much. Likewise, Stan, this goes to your point that California has prioritized sales tax revenue, transient occupancy tax. So there's a systemic incentive to create low-income jobs, and there's a systemic incentive not to approve housing. That's our tax policy. And I really haven't heard much reference to that. So here's my question. The state budget's $200 billion a year. If you want to have 100,000 units of low-income housing a year, just say, we're going to put $40,000 a year from the state into 100,000 units. That's $4 billion. That's 2% of the state budget. And after 10 years, you'd have 1 million more low-income housing units in the state of California. And I'll just stop by saying, Stan, and this goes to some of your point, in terms of unless you create, as long as you have the sales tax and transient and occupancy tax, you can approve it and you don't have the costs, this is always going to be a problem. So it seems to me, like I said, this is a tax issue. You have to provide incentives for people to build housing from the state level, and you have to eliminate the fact that when you approve low-income housing on the demand side, that the local agency keeps all the money, but it doesn't have to share it with the areas that feel the impacts.
Should I just go, Isaac?
Please.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you don't have to convince me to be against Proposition 13 already. We're already kindred spirits here. No, absolutely, right? So, I mean, if a city can't collect money from property tax, then what's the incentive to build anything? Furthermore, there is this tax incentive for NIMBYism, right? If you're insulated because your property tax doesn't go up when your home value increases, and you get to make pretend that it's still 1982 and your ranch home is worth $80,000 or whatever, right? What do you care if the house across the street is now selling for $2 million, right? You're unaffected. So there's no incentive for people to agitate for more housing to try to bring overall prices down, right? There's just sort of no, there's just no reason to do it, right? It's just all pure profit on your end. On the issue of low income housing, of deed restricted affordable housing, we do have this problem in California, though, because of onerous requirements, because of this lengthy discretionary approval process, that one unit of affordable housing can cost on average about $600,000 to construct. The LA Times had this fantastic article by Liam Dillon in 2020, I believe, about an affordable housing project, 100% deed restricted affordable, right? This is so you have to make under a certain amount of money to live there, right? Not just what we think of sort of colloquially as affordable, as like it's a low price, but this is deed restricted, capital A affordable. So this is a 100% deed restricted affordable project in Solana Beach, which is, if you've ever been there, a really, really affluent beach community north of San Diego. Because of a decade of delay, one unit in that project was going to cost $1 million to produce because they had to build underground parking. So when you have these delays, it becomes harder to come up with what's called the funding stack, right? Low-income housing is funded through a variety of tax credits, primarily the low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC as it's known. So sort of delays in like the building process and the approval process make it difficult to put these various funding sources together, right? Which increases the cost of the overall project, right? There's been some moves last year at the state level to make creating that funding stack a bit easier and more streamlined, but there's still a long way to go.
Thank you very much. I have a question in the chat, and I think maybe you can speak to this. Sarah. It's a question from Stanley Zukov, who asks, how does what's the role of tenant protections in the housing crisis? How can they be used? And how does, tenant protections affect people differently across race, class, gender, immigration status, and more?
I mean, I think that they're critical. Like, I mean, I think our anchors are the 3 Ps, you know, protection, preservation, and production, you know, and that is, I mean, like I was saying, you know, tenant policy is equity policy, really, because of how Californians of color are disproportionately renting, you know, majority renting. And so we need to ensure that they are not unjustly evicted, right? Like we talk about, and there has been, so we were talking about with the rent debt, we're talking about being evicted for what typically would be a just cause, right? Like not paying your rent, that's a just cause. Like that's a good cause for eviction, but many people are evicted for other causes, right? And we need the just cause policies that really prevent landlords from evicting without a just cause have been proven to be effective in reducing displacement. So I think there's a slew of tenant protections, like there's, you know, just cause eviction, there's stabilization, you know, rent stabilization as well. There's getting eviction diversion, you know, programs. So there's many different types of tenant protections. I think it's also about like allowing tenants to form unions, which there's a new policy in San Francisco now. Sorry. I was going to say something else. The
Zoom problems. You're talking about tenants unions in San Francisco?
Tenant unions in San Francisco, tenant protections. And kind of tenant opportunity to purchase is another thing that it's challenging here because of the high cost of purchasing. But one thing that we're looking at is, you know, Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. So in San Francisco, actually, they have this. It's a law that when you're building, it happened with my building actually, because I'm a renter in a 4-unit building, and my landlord put it on the market. And then before anyone else could look at it, it went to the nonprofit housing developers. So then they were able to look at it first and put it in an early bid. So it's allowing for the transfer of rental units into nonprofit ownership. So it's really gets to be a form of social housing because it's nonprofit ownership. So the tenant opportunity purchase is when the tenants can actually purchase the buildings themselves, and that's another form of it.
All right, thank you.
Really, really important.
Absolutely. Stuart, go ahead. Sorry, you're on mute. You are on mute, Stuart.
There we go. How's that?
Perfect.
So a couple of things. I guess the first thing is a framing question. When we start out and talk about how those origins are rooted in racism, it implies that the decision-making now is also rooted in racism. And it suggests that, you know, Monique, Limón, Salud Carbajal, who both live in Goleta, yay, are making, you know, advocating for their positions because they're racists. It suggests that the people of Goleta who are advocating for their communities are doing it because they're racists. And so I'm uncomfortable with that kind of framing. It's disparaging people's motives based on something in 1918 or something like that. Another sort of point to make is to recognize that, especially for LA, you know, when you think of what happens in LA, if there's new development, LA is built around cars. It was built around people driving around. If you add a lot of density, if you put in new housing, I'm not talking about the question about affordable, but just adding additional density and more housing, you're automatically expanding or enhancing the congestion. And it wasn't built to handle it. And so that it is appropriate and reasonable that people who are living in a certain area would be resistant and uncomfortable with adding a lot of more housing that'll impact them and their property values. That you can see that any of these state laws and other things that are imposing kinds of housing requirements and so forth are effectively really transferring property rights from the owners of residential single family units to the developers, and they're worse off. So I want to avoid a simplification here and say that property owners are resistant, it's NIMBY, and they don't have a legitimate argument in this process except based on their selfishness and their racism. That they have a voice and it's appropriate, and we have to take it into consideration. And I don't disagree that rents are too high and the costs are too high and that we have to do something to help people. But I also don't think that we should find a villain that's out there that's either the existing renters, or I would add, for a city council, speaking as a person who's on a city council, that it is not that we are not holding things up because we're not getting enough money or because we don't care about people who are renters. I don't think either of those are the case. And democracy, I guess I'd say, in having the state impose requirements on cities and override, assume that cities are the source of the problem because of the process, that democracy is inherently the problem. We should just simply wave away the role for cities in making decisions and just empower the states to without planning, without evaluation of what's going on at the local level, to impose some sort of outcomes. If there's a problem like CEQA is too restrictive, there are problems in it, fix it, but don't waive it. And don't just point at the cities and the residents as villains.
Thanks, Stuart. I want to give the panelists a chance to respond here.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. Sarah, you want to go ahead first? I saw you wanting to chime in.
I just wanted to underscore, I think that there was a chat about it. Like it was really important to distinguish between what is like systemic or structural or institutional racism that has racist impacts, but it's not about the intent necessarily, right? There's like individual racism, and that is like the intent of a person. But we're talking about the ways in which policies are exacerbating existing racial inequities and just contributing to racial inequities and not solving those issues. But it doesn't mean that they were intending to cause those outcomes. It's really about the outcomes that are created by them.
Yeah, I'll just echo Sarah's point, right? I'm not going to ascribe racist intent to people unless I sort of have some personal knowledge of that. But I will say that these laws, single family zoning in particular, was created with explicit racist intent. You can read the Berkeley City Council meeting minutes, and it's there in black and white. But what Sarah mentioned about institutional racism is really important, right? Because even without a specific racial animus, I'm sure many people, most people in California don't really harbor like these explicit sort of racist sentiments. Even without that, it can have these effects that disproportionately affect people of color. For example, most young people in California today are people of color, myself included. My parents came as immigrants in the 1970s to the United States. I'm a first-generation American, but being born when I'm born, housing and home ownership is just completely just a non-starter for me, right? And for people younger than me, it's even worse, right? This sort of limiting of new development, this limiting of opportunity has these knock-on effects that disproportionately affect people of color, right? Even without that intent, the outcome has this disproportionate racial impact. The second point you made is about Los Angeles. And I have to, as an Angelino, I have to sort of push back on this. I apologize. But LA starts as a streetcar city. It's not a car city. It's why it's so awful to drive in this city, because we're not a car city like Phoenix or Houston. We have these stupid little narrow roads that the yellow cars and the red cars used to run up and down, right? So LA is built for density. Los Angeles is built for 10 million people, or had the zone capacity for 10 million people until it began a down zoning about 50 years ago, right? So when we talk about adding density, when we add density, we can start making mass transit viable again, right? We don't have the density in Los Angeles to run transit at the headways you need to make it viable, like cities in Europe do, right? Like cities in Asia do, right? And when we do this, when we make mass transit more viable, we can cut down on vehicle miles traveled, which will reduce the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in California today, which is private passenger vehicles. Most of the gains we made in AB 32 in 2006, this landmark anti-greenhouse gas bill, are being erased right now because more and more people are driving and living farther from where they work, being pushed out of these high opportunity areas in coastal California for inland California, and then just driving for hours on the freeway every day. It's an unsustainable way forward.
All right, thank you. I think we're coming towards the end of our workshop here, but I wanted to give our panelists, Sarah and Stan, a chance to provide brief closing thoughts if they would like, their thoughts on next steps for housing justice in California, what they see as the path forward. Would either of you like to share some brief thoughts?
You can go first, Sarah.
Thank you. This has been a great conversation. I'm impressed by how much we fit into this hour and a half. I think that we flagged a lot of things, like thinking about how do you preserve housing in perpetuity outside of the market as a critical part of the solution, tenant protections as a critical part of the solution, and alleviating these like land use and zoning issues so that we can build housing, because we've been underbuilding. So I think those three things to me stand out.
So I've slagged off local government a lot in my time here, and I want to say some positive things that people can do and talk to their local governments about going forward. It's absolutely true what the supervisor or the state senator said, that locals can be partners, right? Sacramento and Berkeley have recently started a process to remove parking minimums across the city, right? This is a massive, massive step forward in getting people out of cars and building more dense housing where people need it, right? These are two critical things that we need to do if we don't want to have a year-long wildfire season and we don't want to have the average commute time being like 95 minutes one way, right? Los Angeles had this great transit-oriented development program that was really incredible. One, for producing more deed-restricted housing, but two, for putting housing near mass transit, right? So locals can get involved. SB10 allows for locals to upzone near these major transit corridors without having to go through CEQA review first, right? This is a massive, massive opportunity. So I'd urge people to get out there, get to your city council meeting and say yes to new housing, say yes to more development, say yes to new housing units of all types, because we really desperately need it. If we want a state where your kids can live, where young people can live, where there's a future, where this can be a destination for immigrants again, where this can be a place that people come from all over the country and all over the world to live this California dream that a past generation had, then we desperately, desperately, desperately need to create more space for people. As we see the rollback of rights for people across the country, California needs to serve as a refuge, and it can't serve as a refuge if we're only building mansions and we're only thinking about how can we preserve the status quo.
Thank you very much. And on that inspirational note, I would like to thank everyone for joining us at this housing workshop today. I would especially like to thank the state senator for her opening remarks and our panelists, Stan and Sarah. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks to all of you for coming and attending. As Alice mentioned at the top of this program, I would like to remind you that we'll be doing our second workshop 2 weeks from today on April 28th. We will be focusing on the crisis of housing in our very own community here in Isla Vista and thinking about the ways in which this crisis has particularly affected the UC Santa Barbara community. Thank you all.